Frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is for motor, planning, language, mood, olfaction, and social judgment. Parietal lobe. The parietal lobe receives and integrates sensory information. It's related to spatial learning and attention. Our temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is for hearing, olfaction, learning, memory, and emotional behavior. And the occipital lobe in the back. Occipital is for visual processing and visual memory storage.
Up next is the brainstem. We have the midbrain, which is primarily responsible for vision, hearing, and eye movements. Then the pons, responsible for posture, sleep, hearing, balance, taste, eye movements, facial expression, facial sensation, respiration, swallowing, and bladder control. And then the medulla, which is important for our cardiac center, which monitors heart rate and force, our vasomotor center, our respiratory centers, and then reflex centers such as coughing, sneezing, gagging, swallowing, vomiting, salivation, sweating, movements of the tongue, and head.
Primary motor cortex, M1. This is the precentral gyrus. The primary motor cortex will relay signals to the spinal cord. It supplies muscles of the contralateral side. It contains a repertoire of more elementary movements. So it's organized movements rather than individual muscles being encoded. Secondary motor areas. The premotor area. So premotor is just a lexicon of more elaborate movements. It's for selection and attention to perform complex movement sequences. It's involved in motor planning, and it can send information to the motor cortex. Then we have the supplementary motor area, so the SMA. This is involved in planning complex movements and coordinating movements involving both hands.
Broca's area is in the frontal and temporal lobes. It affects the ability to produce language efficiently. Broca's aphasia is a deficit in the motor planning aspects of language.
Next is the cerebellum. The cerebellum acts as a comparator. It directs motor error, the difference between intended and actual movement. It's involved in the regulation and coordination of voluntary movement, posture and equilibrium, and the regulation of muscle tone through vestibular nuclei. It's also important for motor learning and procedural memory.
Next, the basal ganglia. We have the caudate, followed by the putamen, and the globus pallidus. These are all parts of the basal ganglia, which is important for initiating and terminating movement, primarily through the disinhibition of the thalamus.
The primary sensory cortex, or S1, is near the postcentral gyrus. It is responsible for complex aspects of single sensory modalities. Wernicke's area is near the lateral fissure and near the parietal and temporal lobes. It is responsible for understanding spoken language. Wernicke's aphasia is that causes difficulty understanding spoken language. The association area integrates diverse information for purposeful action. It is involved in perception, movement, and motivation. The primary visual cortex. Each hemisphere's primary visual cortex receives information from the ipsilateral geniculate nucleus that receives signals from the contralateral visual hemifield. The visual association area receives sensory impulses from the primary visual area and integrates visual information. It evaluates what is seen and compares to past experience. The primary auditory cortex. This processes auditory information. The auditory association area is in the temporal lobe adjacent to Wernicke's area. This integrates auditory signals.
Next is the thalamus, the sensory relay system. Everything processes through the thalamus except for the olfaction. Adjacent is the hypothalamus, which is primarily responsible for homeostasis. As we look on the side of the temporal lobe, we have the parahippocampal gyrus, which houses the hippocampus. What we can see in the coronal section over here. There's the gyrus, and then inside right there is the hippocampus.
The hippocampus is responsible for learning and memory. It converts short-term to more permanent memory, and it's for recalling spatial relationships to the world around us. Its main function is with memory and memory consolidation. It contains declarative memory, daily episodes, and words and their meaning, and also is involved with spatial learning.
Next is the uncus, again on the underside of the temporal lobe, which houses the amygdala, the final part of the limbic system.
The amygdala, which is deep in that area, the amygdala is responsible for memory and emotions, especially fear.